It's been a weird few months since my dad died. In case you missed the past couple of videos about his illness, he had a glioblastoma, a brain tumor which took his life about 18 months from the time of his diagnosis. He died mid-December of 2023, the age of 70. It's now April of the next year, and already among other milestones like his 71st birthday, he's missed the first warm day of spring. As I walked along the East River in a t-shirt, I thought of the final time he ventured outside on an unseasonably warm late fall afternoon. I wheeled him into the courtyard on his transport chair, and he sat for a few minutes until he got too cold. Even then, I knew it was probably the last time he'd feel the sun on his skin, though, like many pressing morbid thoughts that surfaced along the way, I kept it to myself. As a caregiver, I devoted much of my time to ensuring my dad's last few months were as easy as possible, which, those months were not easy for him at all. To say he was miserable would be like describing Niagara Falls as a leaky faucet. He suffered tremendously, and it's only now, after much reflection, that I begin to grasp the extent of that suffering. When you're in the moment, you really only deal with things on a minute-to-minute basis. There's multiple crises every day, so you don't have time to process what's happening. Things just happen, and you solve problems as best you can. But the cumulative sum of those problems becomes lost in a complex equation that lengthens faster than it can be solved, at least until after death has occurred, and you can essentially catch up. That's one of the things I've been doing for a few months, starting to come to terms with what my dad's death means. There's a lot of societal expectation, at least in the United States, to move on quickly from a loved one's passing, to forge ahead with your head held high. That's what he'd want you to do, or he's still with you in your heart. And there's some truth to that sentiment, of course, but it doesn't erase the fact of that person's absence. We're habitual creatures, and even the most introverted among us, and I include myself in that description, need some amount of social interaction. My dad was one of the few people with whom I interacted every day, even if it was just via a text or two. He'd share news articles he thought I'd like, or recommend TV shows, or ask about a recent doctor appointment. Or when he bought something for himself and shipped it to me, like Tupperware containers, he might buy an extra box for me to keep. And when my toilet was running and all the usual fixes were ineffective, he could solve it in a jiffy. All those interactions stopped upon his death. Actually, because of his condition, they stopped a good bit before he died, making the line between his life and death that much more blurry. Something he understood at the time, while I'm only beginning to understand months later. Now let me explain by rewinding a bit to just after his second brain surgery in August 2023. And when he woke up and realized how the surgery and the following seizures had stolen what remained of his quality of life, he was crushed. He didn't want to live, and that's pretty much the only thing he would put effort into saying. At the time, I was still very much in crisis management mode. I wanted to solve the problem, to get him rehabilitated and back home. Except there was one pesky, inescapable fact. The neurosurgeon had said before the procedure that even the most successful surgery would only buy my dad perhaps 2 to 3 months, and that his life expectancy was similarly abysmal with or without the procedure. 2 months is not a lot of time, especially considering it took the better part of a month to bring my dad home. He simply did not want to endure his condition any longer. I'm not certain whether his expressed and repeated desire for it to be over was an explicit request for euthanasia or more of the strongest possible way to convey frustration. Back when he was more capable, he talked a few times about going to Vermont to at least have the option to end his own life with medical supervision, but he never took steps to make that happen, and I am left wondering whether he would have done it if it was allowed in New York, where he lived. For a long time, I have believed that the option of assisted suicide should be legal everywhere because everyone should have autonomy over their body, including the choice to end its operation. And my experience with glioblastoma has only strengthened my conviction. I also understand that religion or other beliefs may make that idea reprehensible to some, and that's totally fine, but I still prefer to make that choice for myself and for others to make that choice for themselves, especially with considered guardrails to prevent accidents. My dad wasn't able to make that choice in New York, and so he perhaps suffered needlessly. When the only prospect is an agonizing decline, no existence can be preferable to existence. And until you've taken care of someone in such a compromised position, or have been in that position yourself, it's difficult to fully internalize what it means to suffer beyond the limits of human endurance. Let me give you 3 examples. First and foremost, because of the location of my dad's tumor, he lost the ability to communicate. Imagine not being able to express your thoughts to anyone, even your most basic needs like using the toilet or wanting a specific food. I remember an instance when my dad was trying to tell me what he wanted from a Chinese restaurant. He liked the egg rolls from one place and the hot and sour soup from another. He'd been getting these 2 items for years, but now he couldn't tell me which place was which. It might sound absurd, but I'd never seen him get so enraged over anything more than his inability to explain which food he wanted. It was so simple, and he knew what he wanted to say, yet he couldn't say it with words or writing. Now, apply this issue to literally everything he wanted to say, and understandably, he just gave up trying to communicate at all, which deepened his depression. Second, his most innate mental abilities, those skills he prided himself on, vanished. He was quite good at math, able to intuitively understand concepts and apply them to his work and hobbies. Then, seemingly overnight, he couldn't even tell me if one number was larger than another. Was 5 bigger or smaller than 10? He had no idea. And worst of all, he was acutely aware of this deficit. He knew it was absurd that he couldn't grasp these basic concepts, and he experienced this loss as a loss of identity. When those skills that make us who we are vanish, what's left? If I couldn't write or draw anymore, what joy would or could I find? My dad certainly lost all ability to find joy. Third, my dad loved to build, tinker, take photos. His tumor increased the risk of seizures, and those seizures were often caused by using the right side of his body. So if he wanted to avoid seizures, he also had to avoid movement. And as the disease progressed, he couldn't have moved even if he wanted to, especially not the right side of his body. I had to help him do everything the last few months of his life, from eating to using the toilet. The absence of movement, speech, and mental ability combined to strip him of every single thing that made him happy. The losses themselves were bad enough, but add to them the indisputable fact that these deficits were permanent and that his very life would soon be ending. What then did he have to live for? Again, it's only now, a few months after his death, that I can fully internalize these realities. In the moment, I just wanted to help him on a day-to-day basis. When he expressed that he no longer wanted to live, my main thought was diffusing the depression by focusing on the practical reality of our shared predicament. Yes, he was going to die soon, but he was alive then, so why not try to get as much out of life as possible? After all, we didn't know how much or little time he had left, at least not precisely. Yet, looking back, I think my perspective was naive. Something the hospice nurses knew, which I'll get into in a moment. But because my dad's decline wasn't abrupt, it was hard to really see the overall picture, that blurred line between life and death I mentioned earlier. It's not like we were taking snapshots of his existence and comparing it to a month ago, 3 months ago, 3 years ago. Think of it this way. When someone has a serious stroke, they can go from being completely functional to almost entirely non-functional in just a few minutes. This makes the dichotomy between past and present selves obvious. Because my dad declined over the course of 2 years since before his diagnosis, I had more time to become used to each lesser version of him. I accepted his decline as it happened without understanding the loss he felt. I mean, he was clearly comparing every moment of his suffering to his life before the illness, and I think that's natural. The hospice workers who visited us, though, saw the situation for what it was. A man mired in terrible depression, suffering needlessly through a terminal condition. By the time he was in hospice, he couldn't leave his bed, he couldn't speak, he couldn't use half his body. To clean him and keep him from developing bed sores required moving his inactive limbs, and he sometimes reacted with extreme shouts of apparent pain, but he would claim he wasn't in pain whenever asked, so it was impossible to tell what exactly was going on. I imagine whatever sensations he was experiencing on the right side of his body were, at the very least, bizarrely uncomfortable. The hospice nurses who visited 2 to 3 times a week urged us to increase his morphine dose to alleviate the discomfort. But here's the thing. My dad didn't like taking morphine because of how it made him feel, and even in the last month of his life, he was aware enough to refuse morphine and accept Tylenol instead, indicating that he understood the difference. And he also knew that morphine caused constipation, no matter how many laxatives he took, necessitating someone to, and this is gross, literally dig impacted fecal matter from his rectum. Another horrible experience he endured multiple times near the end of life. As his consciousness dwindled, my mom and I searched for signs that some version of him was still in there, mostly so we could respect his previously stated and written wishes. We knew from his living will that he did not want any life-saving interventions. No breathing machine, feeding tubes, or even IV hydration that would prolong his life when the end was near. His refusal of morphine was less clear. I think part of it was an attempt to exert some tiny manner of control over his situation. He was a very controlling person, wanting to do everything himself and not trusting others to do even basic tasks. And he valued his consciousness, as diminished as it had become. Morphine would alter and dull his awareness, so we didn't want to overmedicate him before it became absolutely necessary. It was only in the last week or two of his life that we followed the hospice workers' recommendations to the letter, once my dad's nods and shaking of his head in response to our questions became indecipherable. In those days, I wasn't sure he recognized me or knew what was going on or could even see. During his last week of life, we administered Ativan to prevent seizures and morphine to alleviate discomfort whenever he was distressed, so that he could die in relative peace. Though at that point, it was impossible to communicate with him and understand even a bit of what he was thinking or feeling. After his death, there was, and still is, a lot to do. Cleaning, dealing with his finances, property, and other loose ends. The tasks seem never to end. They can be a good distraction, but focusing on them too much leads to a buildup of emotion. Making these videos has been an outlet for me to express some of that. You don't see this part because I don't post it, but while working on these videos, I have burst into tears when thinking about certain aspects of my dad's decline. Grief is like a wound with many cuts. You cauterize the damage so that scars form, but you always miss some spots. Then you cry in shock when one of those spots is exposed. When I come up with a point I want to make in these videos, it's like I'm cauterizing that particular painful memory, So that the next time I think of it, while it's still sad, it's no longer shockingly sad, if that makes sense. But when I consider a new perspective, the shock returns in a wave of renewed grief. Over time, the arrival of these perspectives grows more infrequent until I have considered the situation from every angle. Then all that's left is a lingering sadness or grief at the situation. I've heard that the first year after death is the hardest, simply because it's filled with firsts. There was my dad's 71st birthday, which came and went without much fanfare. Then there are smaller firsts, like the first time I washed my car, something we would often do together. I used the same bucket, soap, sponge, and hose, yet the most important part, the person, was gone. Grief is powerful and pervasive, but it isn't the only emotion. Accompanying the grief is a reaction to the trauma of the ordeal. Caring for my dad traumatized me in many ways, but two stick out. First, all the physical acts of maintaining another person's body, especially a close relative, are overwhelming. I can't shake the imagery of some of the things I did for my dad, like cleaning up his diapers or putting on his pee condom. I'm not a prudish person or afraid of nudity, it's just that doing this sort of thing to my father in particular is so wildly different from anything in our shared past that it's shockingly incongruous. And that in turn leads me to the bigger picture trauma, as I like to think of it. All the small moments, every visit to the emergency room, the seizures, the cleaning of private parts, they all add up to a portrait of mortality. I've never shied away from the concept of death, mine or others. I remember laying in bed when I was perhaps 10 years old, thinking about when I or my parents might die. Barring illness, I figured I'd be at least 50 before my mom or dad kicked the bucket, but imagining something and experiencing that same thing just aren't the same. My dad's death kicked me into a new phase of life, one in which he no longer exists. We are all going to die. It's an underlying fact that exists from the moment we're born, and people deal with this truth in different ways, whether it be acceptance through meditation or religion, fear, destructive behavior, or distraction. My dad's death brought the idea of the end of life closer than it has ever been. Because of the way our society is structured to hide death and dying, nothing prepared me for the reality of it. It gets weirder the more I think about it. When I was in 4th grade, my school rightly began its sex ed program, preparing me for what might have otherwise been the traumatizing realities of puberty. Just about everyone goes through puberty, so it makes sense to educate children about its effects on their bodies and minds. Yet, another thing that absolutely everyone goes through is death, but there's no training about that, no death education or preparation. You're just thrust into the trauma of it with no guidelines or guardrails. Unless you're lucky, doctors don't particularly care. Their jobs begin and end at the door. And hospice is often too little too late. I think most people are woefully unprepared, which leads to trauma. I've been combating this trauma with a perhaps unhealthy level of productivity. For months, I hadn't focused on my writing or other productive tasks. Since my dad died, I have been obsessively working on projects that have gone untouched for a long while. For example, I'm finally getting to work on a pilot animation for one of my novels. My next video will be about that project, so feel free to subscribe if you're interested. And I'm finishing writing the second half of a new novel. Anyway, do follow along for updates on that and other stuff if you're interested, of course. Either way, I wanted to say thank you for all the kind and supportive comments. Like I said, I made these videos as an outlet for emotions and thoughts that would otherwise just be confined to my head. Still, I can't tell you how glad I am to see that some of these thoughts have helped others in similar situations. If you're a caregiver or someone for whom this disease has exacted a personal toll, I wish you nothing but the very best of luck. Before I end the video, I did want to address one other topic, and that's guilt. I've touched upon it in previous videos, but guilt has always been my constant companion. No matter the situation, I always feel that I should have done more. During and after my dad's illness, I can't help but analyze all the mistakes I made, all the things I would have done differently. That sort of guilt is something I've come to expect, but what I failed to anticipate was survivor's guilt. And parents typically die before their children, so I didn't think I'd feel this nagging sense of guilt after my dad's passing. When I do something fun now, like drive to see the solar eclipse, I wish my dad was there, and more than that, I feel guilty that I am able to do these things while he is not. Why should I get to enjoy my time when his time is ended? I know it's a foolish thought, one that makes almost no logical sense for myriad reasons, yet I think it nonetheless. Looking back on the few months since my dad's death, it feels both like an eternity has passed and also no time at all. How can my time as a caregiver both be a distant memory and a fresh wound? If I'm lucky enough to live anywhere close to my father's age, I'm sure these traumas, the guilt, the restless thoughts will morph and shift, rise and flow over the years and decades. As the illness fades into the past, I hope the positive memories from the years before my dad got sick will grow in strength and become my primary focus. I guess I'll find out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.